Hi everyone, welcome to the overview for unit number 6. Just in case you're wondering, I'm just starting here, scrolling down, and you have to do this every time of course, but it's interesting just for us to look and see all the things that we've done so far. We're about halfway through this course, and we've already talked about so many different things about reading and about teaching vocabulary, which is of course directly related to reading, but in unit number 6, we are continuing our discussion of vocabulary, and we are going to talk about basically the whole idea of unit number 6 is about how to teach vocabulary. We started it in unit number 5, where we talked about general and academic vocabulary, we talked about word lists, talked about corpora and concordancing. So in this unit, what we're going to do is continue on with that, but we're going to connect it to some other skills. So, of course, this is the overview. Here is the link to the PowerPoint. In terms of big ideas for this particular unit, in the PowerPoint, I do point out the big ideas from the Cox Head reading, but I also talk about a couple of myths, vocabulary myths that Keith Folsey talks about. And so I thought that was an interesting thing for us to think about, whether or not you view these myths positively or negatively, or what you think about them. So as you're reading through this particular lecture, when you get to that section about vocabulary myths, try to keep in mind that I'm putting that in there to get you thinking about how you teach vocabulary, and are you doing it just automatically the way that you have been taught how to do it, or are you thinking about whether or not these different ways of teaching vocabulary are actually effective? Because that's the big thing that we want to think about in unit number 6. How do we effectively teach vocabulary? So before we get to our big ideas, really, let's just take a quick look at the different things that are available to you in unit number 6. You've got just these two are your required readings. You've got a lot of optional readings here for you. We've had questions about, for example, using dictionaries. So if you want to read a little bit more about that, that's available to you. There's also some other items about vocabulary learning that are here in these particular optional readings. And I always give you the reason for reading them if you want to know a little bit more information. In this unit, I have a number of videos. There's 4 videos there. I think the longest one here of these 4 is 10 minutes. The rest are like 6 minutes or so. These are really interesting because it's a lecture about teaching vocabulary in context. And even though this is an optional video, I do encourage you to at least take a look at them and start thinking about if you'd like to watch all of them, because there are some really good pointers in these particular lectures. Then there's 2 really short ones there, I think 4 minutes, about 4 minutes each, in an actual classroom doing vocabulary cards, and then one about content, vocabulary math. Our emphasis, of course, in this course is about teaching academic content, and math is one of the things that you can focus on in your different content adaptations. In this unit, we've got the discussion board, which is actually a preparation for your task. So my goal for this unit is to get feedback back to everyone as quickly as possible, because you are going to have a discussion about the task that you're going to do. So what I'd like you to do is do the task. Do the discussion board. These are some questions you can talk about, and then what I'd like you to do after you're done, after you get some feedback from me and from the rest of your colleagues, is to do the task, which is down below, and it's about selecting and teaching academic vocab. You are writing an essay here, you're not doing a lesson plan, but it talks to me about a particular academic reading that you have selected, and you're going to talk about that in the discussion board. And in the essay, you talk about how you would teach the academic vocabulary that you have selected. You can give me an appendix with the list of the vocab, or whatever you intend to do with the vocabulary. Either give me the link whether the reading's coming from, if it's online or just a sample of the reading. You don't have to give me the whole thing if it's a really long text, but a couple pages just to give me that. Just copy and paste those pictures into the Word document, and don't submit lots of items, but just copy and paste into one document, and it makes it a lot easier to handle when I'm grading. So those two are connected. So this is kind of a pre-writing, and then this is the final piece of writing. Uh, in the writing assignment, I'm asking you to do something similar to what you did for reading, where you're going to look at the readings we've had for teaching academic vocabulary as they relate to your students. So first in this writing assignment, you briefly describe your students, the course, the institution, and then just list 3 specific activities that you think would be most effective for them. And you're going to justify each selection. So in the justifications, that's where you'd put your citations. So this is a shorter writing assignment that I'm asking for, because you're not writing an essay, you're just making lists of the type of activities that you would use from our readings with your particular students. Okay, so the big ideas for this particular unit are really all about how to teach your particular students vocabulary and in an effective way. So what does it mean to teach vocabulary effectively? Basically, it means that in the long term, your students will be able to read or hear the particular vocabulary that you're teaching and understand that word in context. So the keys are long-term recall and the ability to understand. Now, it's great if they can also use the words in their own particular writing, but think of all the words that you know and understand when you hear it or read it, but that you don't necessarily use when you are writing or speaking. You understand a much larger number than you actually use. So remember that using is not necessarily the goal here. Now, if it's a high frequency word, I could see that you would want your students to be able to use them. And of course, for the most part, you are teaching or probably trying to teach the high frequency words. But remember that it's whatever your activities you are doing and whatever assessment you give to determine whether these lessons have been effective need to be over the long term and to demonstrate the student's ability to understand it as it's being used. Now, does that mean that your students have to know the definition of these words? I would argue no, because there's lots of words that you know. Again, think about all the words you know that you may have a little bit of difficulty just coming up with a definition right on the spot. So just because you don't know the definition exactly doesn't mean you don't understand the word as it's being used in the particular context that you see it or hear it. So again, remember that that's just knowing the definition is probably not the kind of assessment that you would want to have for your particular students. You want to have a different kind of assessment. So think about the assessments that you would use to determine whether your vocabulary instruction has been effective. The other thing to think about is the idea that, and this is something you should talk to your students about, how are your students learning vocabulary in an effective way? Talk about the metacognitive skills about learning vocabulary, what works for them in terms of learning, the different strategies that they have. Talk to them about those strategies and ask them and get their feedback and talk to them about other options. Make them aware of how they are learning. So you've got these metacognitive ideas, but you also have the idea that your students just aren't going to learn a lot of vocabulary, relatively speaking, in your class. So you have to think about what words you're selecting to focus on in your lessons. Are they high frequency? Are they the most useful words that you can really work on with your students? That's really important. That's a big idea. Selection is absolutely critical. So what words are you selecting for your students? And talk to them about the fact that while you are learning vocabulary in this class, whatever you're teaching, whether it's reading or writing or speaking and listening, the majority of the vocabulary that they're going to be exposed to would ideally be from all the extensive reading that they're doing. So no matter what class you are teaching, talking to your students about extensive reading, figuring out ways to encourage extensive reading is only going to improve their vocabulary. And talking to them about the fact that the best ways to latch on to an extensive vocabulary is to do the extensive readings. So those are some of the big ideas that I think are really important in this particular unit, things that we've talked about in the past, having an influence on the kinds of vocabulary and the different kinds of activities that you would do with your students. So this unit is all about teaching vocabulary, learning vocabulary, figuring out the best ways for your particular students. But you have to think about some of these other things that we've talked about in the past, like extensive reading, intensive reading, um, talking to your students about their metacognitive skills in terms of learning how to read. All of these things are coming into play now, so it's important for us to remember the things from the previous units and apply them to this particular unit about teaching and learning vocabulary. I hope you enjoy this unit. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing what you guys do in the assignments this week. Thanks.